Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. Today I'm going to be exploring the leafy area of Primrose Hill and Belsize Park to see what it has to offer on the pub front. This is a bit of a well-heeled area of London, and consequently all of the pubs have gone a little bit gastro. But I'm hoping somehow we can still find a few places that still retain that all-important pubby pub feel. Pub number one, the Albert. Cheers from the Albert. Let's take a look at the exterior first. I believe the pub was built around 1850. It's a handsome corner pub in stock brick with stucco dressings, including these curved windows at one corner. The ground floor pub frontage is lined with these garlanded columns with Corinthian capitals. Between those are a total of 4 entrances and windows with stained glass, advertising the drinks offering. These look interwar to me, possibly 1930s. It's a former Charrington house, and we've seen this style of windows at other pubs which had previously been owned by them. Beneath the windows are these green glazed tiles. At a guess, they're of a similar age to the windows. Taking a look inside, there is a nice stout bar counter with rounded corners showing some matchboard panelling, while the panelling on the main faces is fielded. I guess this dates to that Charrington's era. There's some nice cornicing around the whole of the interior, which the Primrose Hill history website believes to be original. There is dado height fielded panelling around the walls, unfortunately today painted in some kind of turquoise. Pubs do seem to love that, don't they? A cast iron fireplace with some nice classical detailing. The columns in the fireplace are of a similar style to those internally supporting the ceiling of the main bar room and externally, so that's a hint that it may actually be of a similar age. Above the fireplace is a portrait of Prince Albert. It also has this very nice garden area out the back, particularly pleasant on a surprisingly sunny January day. Did I also mention it has what appears to be a pub cat? I think it's not actually allowed inside the pub, but he or she has come to say hello. Hello, pub cat. How are you doing? Well, I assume you're a pub cat. Maybe you're just a neighbour's cat that's trying to invade the pub. The cat seems to want to gate crash my video. You're just going to sit there? Cat bombing. Well, you're lovely and everything, but I do have a video to get on with, I'm afraid. I'll just try and talk around the cat. Here is the surrounding area on Greenwood's map of 1828, and you can see that much of it was still yet to be developed. This section of Regent's Canal was completed in about 1816, and the canal bridge here is where Regent's Park Road crosses today. So the future location of the pub, I believe built in 1850, is close to here. According to the Primrose Hill history website, the pub appears on an 1849 map, and they also mention that Princess Road, which was called Princess Terrace for some of the 19th century, was likely named after one of Queen Victoria's daughters, either Helena, born 1846, or Louise, born in 1848. The cat's in the way of the camera. By the time of this OS map of 1870, the area had been well developed, and we can see the pub marked here on the corner with a PH. Note the railway cottages nearby, suggesting that in the 19th century some of the pub's customers may have been railway workers. If we zoom in a bit, there is a nice depiction of the pub's garden at that point in time with its ring of trees. It's a little bit smaller today, but it's still very pleasant. And here's the pub a couple of decades later on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, by which time the street names have also changed to those we see today. The pub is on the corner of Princess Road and Kingstown Street. The earliest, I think, newspaper mention I could find is from 1853. I didn't seem to do much more research about the history of this pub. It's got a cat though, did I mention the cat? The pub says Freehouse on the exterior. Camera lists it as independent, but also mentions a licence has been granted to Sam Moss of Leeds Brewery. There is actually one beer on the lineup from Leeds Brewery, Leeds Pale. I also saw Harvey's Sussex Best, so that is of course what I went for, having a half of that, and I'll put the price down there on the screen. Pub number 2, the Engineer. Cheers from the Engineer. This is both a listed building, so we have notes from Historic England, and it's on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors, so quite a lot has been written about both the exterior and the interior of this pub. Historic England cite it as a public house of circa 1845 to 1850, and it was built originally for Calvert's, the brewers. It's in brown stock brick, is it? Looks more like red brick to me. They describe it as being Italianate in style. I'm not sure we've heard that for a pub before. Historic England do include a couple of sentences about the interior as well. They're a bit more pessimistic, and they say that the interiors have lost all fittings of special interest, save for their cornices. However, I don't think Camera's notes on the interior agree with that. They think that the bar counter is old at least, and possibly original. They write that it has scrollwork atop the vertical supports and a cantered forward. They also mention that in its current guise, the counter front has been stripped of all its varnish. It's a fairly sort of bare, is this called shabby chic? Most of the bar back is modern, but there is this one really interesting corner section in a 3-bay configuration, and that is apparently older, possibly Victorian, although the clock in there is noted as being relatively modern. Oh, I should add, this is another pub with a surprisingly nice and big garden out the back as well, just like the Albert where we were earlier. Let's talk a little bit about the pub name, the engineer. The modern interpretation for that is that it is a reference to Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and that is reflected in the sign today. However, as the Primrose Hill history website points out, Isambard Kingdom Brunel wasn't connected with any of the local major engineering projects. He didn't work on the London and Birmingham Railway. That was the work of Robert Stephenson, the son of George Stephenson, he of rocket fame. So it seems to me more likely the name engineer is actually referring to Robert Stephenson, a very celebrated engineer in his own right. Let's take a look at the history. It's of a similar age to the Albert nearby and was likely built in the latter half of the 1840s, as previously noted. The earliest record on the London Wiki or pub's history site is 1856 in the Post Office directory. You can see on the 1870 Ordnance Survey map just how the railway and associated depots, sheds, etc. dominate the surrounding landscape here. The pub is marked with a PH. Again, it seems likely that in the 19th century, many of the customers of this pub would have been railway workers. More recently, one of the former landladies of the pub was Tamsin Olivier, daughter of the actor Sir Laurence Olivier. I believe she was also an actor in her own right, possibly had a bit part in EastEnders. She was here at the helm until 2011, when Mitchell and Butlers took over the full management of the pub. Here's a look at what's on the bar lineup. I, of course, initially chose the Timothy Taylor's Landlord, but it seems that that was still in the process of being changed, so instead I went for a half of London Pride. I'll put the price down there. Pub number 3, the Washington. Cheers from the Washington. This is another pub which is both a listed building and it's on camera, the Campaign for Real Ales list of historic pub interiors. Historic England dates the pub to around 1865, and we know the name of the developer here. It's Daniel Tidy, who was also responsible for developing a lot of the buildings in the surrounding area. There's a lot of classical features here. Of course, I enjoyed the Corinthian columns along the frontage. These rusticated blocks marked out in stucco on the ground floor, and on the first floor on that corner there is a pedimented edicule containing a portrait of George Washington. As I said, we have notes from camera. It's on their list of historic interiors. As they describe it, the Washington has some spectacular Victorian features. A lot of hardwood partitions and screens with glass inlays in them. And interestingly here, we have quite a lot of coloured glass. I've seen a lot of screens in Victorian pubs as partitions and other parts of the interior, but it's relatively rare to see them with coloured glass rather than typical plain glass. It's towards the back of the pub where there is some of the finest work, the back painted mirrors here, and that depicts flowers and birds and other scenes from nature, all set around the fireplace here. Towards the back of the pub is a nice vestibule which contains some painted tiles, including a depiction of George Washington. That's also, as camera's notes point out, oddly juxtaposed with some languid classical ladies. Note also, close to that bust of George Washington, the name W. Holman, which I believe identifies the proprietor of the pub at that time. And looking at the census records, I believe that was Walter Holman. Looking to the bar counter, there is an odd mishmash of styles there. I counted at least 2, possibly 3 different styles to the bar counter, and that's sometimes an indication that this pub was originally subdivided inside, and we had one style of bar counter for the public bar, another for the saloon bar, and so on. There are definitely some modern elements mixed in with those original elements, and it's a bit of an interesting sort of mishmash of old and new in places, but the older parts that still exist I think are really quite beautiful. As I say, it's relatively rare to see coloured screens in partitions in these pub interiors from that late Victorian period. It seems to be generally assumed that this pub was named for George Washington. That struck me as slightly odd. Why in 1860s London would you name a pub after the President of America? We have that portrait of Washington in the edicule on the exterior, although that's almost certainly much more recent, and we have that portrait in those tiles in the vestibule towards the back of the pub, but we know that that dates to the 1890s. I actually think the real reason this pub is called the Washington is something else. Daniel Tidy, the developer, was also the licensee of the pub for the first few years, and you can see him listed here in the 1871 census. The most intriguing detail of this historical record is Daniel Tidy's place of birth. It's Washington in Sussex. So I think that is the real reason that this pub is called the Washington. Daniel Tidy, the developer and first landlord of the pub, was in fact naming the pub after his hometown. That seemed like a fantastic scoop when I found that record, but alas, I'm not the first person to have reported this. I found out later it does also appear in Ted Brunning's fantastic book London by Pub. Incidentally, I have been to the village of Washington in Sussex. It has a nice pub called the Franklin Arms. They do a very good pint of Harvey's Sussex Best there. Today this is another Mitchell and Butler's pub in their Castle brand, the one they use for historic pubs. I went for a half of Timothy Taylor's Landlord. Pub number 4, the Haverstock Tavern. Cheers from the Haverstock Tavern. The current building dates to 1863, and you can see that in this pediment at the top of the building in the midst of this balustrade. And that also has the pub's former name, the Load of Hay. The balustrade there has a sort of swirly design inside it, almost reminiscent of Celtic knots. There is some nice classical detailing around the windows as well. The ground floor frontage is today painted in blue. There's an ironwork grille along the southernmost entrance to the pub, a big bay window entrance to the pub, and we've seen similar ironwork grilles over entrances, particularly in many pubs across North London. That curved entrance beyond there appears to have some etched glass in it, and one of the doors says Pale Ales on it. I wondered if that might have been old brewery livery, but looking at it a bit more closely, it's probably a bit more modern. Inside, relatively modern. The bar counter has a rounded corner at one end with these supports in it. There is a column supporting the ceiling with a bit more classical detailing, a Corinthian capital there. There is quite a nice effect with the light coming through those windows, particularly that bay curved entrance there. A couple of fireplaces. Both of those look like they have wood around them, but to me has a sort of interwar feel to it. I was probably seeing it today in a really good light because you have the sun, the late afternoon sun shining through those windows, and I happily had the place all to myself for the first part of my visit. This pub was originally named the Load of Hay, as hinted at in that pediment at the top of the building, and in fact I believe reverted to that name briefly for a few years in the 21st century. Today it is once again the Haverstock Tavern. The Haverstock Tavern simply comes from the name of the road. This is on Haverstock Hill, but the Load of Hay, I presume, is a testament to this area's agricultural past. Camera's website suggests that this pub dates all the way back to 1721. There are Sun Fire Office insurance records for it that I found going back to at least 1796. The earliest newspaper mention I could find is from 1805. That's an account of court proceedings at the Old Bailey wherein one John Alston was being tried for assault. I like the phrase here, a long train of intemperate language ensued. Shortly after that, an obituary of 1806 appears in the annual register for the landlord of the Load of Hay, who sounds like a bit of a character and permanently drunk. American author Washington Irving refers to the pub in his book Tales of a Traveller, published in 1824, which recounts some of his time spent in Europe. It seems for a time he had lived at Richard Steele's cottage, which was just opposite the pub here, and there is a pub across the road, the Sir Richard Steele, that I'm sure some of you will say I should have gone into today. Washington Irving clearly hoped that Sir Richard Steele's cottage would make a wonderful writer's retreat, being in a semi-rural location as it was at that time. As it turned out, he was there during haymaking season and was constantly disturbed by the noise from the haymakers drinking in the pub opposite. He paints quite an evocative picture of what it would have been like. Here would they gather in the endless summer twilight, all by the light of the harvest moon, and sit round a table at the door and tipple and laugh and quarrel and fight and sing drowsy songs and dawdle away the hours until the deep solemn notes of St. Paul's clock would warn the varlets home. It's actually named on Greenwood's map of 1828, which is quite unusual, and you can see at that time, apart from a few buildings lining the road leading up to Hampstead, this area was largely fields. The pub is mentioned in Old and New London for its tea garden, being at one time a famous stopping off point for Londoners on their way to Hampstead Heath. Prior to that 1863 rebuild, it had apparently been a picturesque wooden structure, but the book laments that subsequently it degenerated into a mere suburban gin palace. It's operated as an independent pub, as it says on the outside. The operator is the Haverstock Pub Company. I believe they only run this one pub. I went for a half of Harvey's Sussex Best. Pub number 5, the Lord Southampton. Cheers from the Lord Southampton. This is not a listed building, so we don't have notes from Historic England, but it does have a local listing from Camden Council. They cite it as being a mid-19th century public house. They draw attention to the rusticated coins. You can see those on the upper floors, not on the ground floor. And the interesting, slightly unusual window architraves, quite elaborate plasterwork around the windows on those upper floors. And they also point out that it is 1 story taller than the surrounding buildings, so it does sort of project from the corner here. A few brief notes from camera as well. Of course, they mostly focus on the interior. They refer to it as a prominent corner site community local. It was given a major refit between the walls, and that's evidenced by some of the faience tiling on the exterior on the ground floor. They describe the colours as buff and mottled dark blue. Inside, this is on camera's list of historic pub interiors, and they note that although some of the internal partitions, as always, were lost, in this case it was a little bit later in the 1970s and early 1980s, you can still get a sense of an earlier layout here. The interior is mostly interwar, possibly 1930s, and the first sense of that comes in the wood panelling that is all around the walls. The bar counter, apparently also of that era, and at least some parts of the bar back fitting. One of the most atmospheric parts of the pub is a sort of winding room to one side of the bar that curves around a corner here with much more of that wood panelling and some cosy little nooks and crannies there that has its own glazed access to the servery. So at one time they would have served drinks through there too. Presumably this would have been something like the saloon bar or a snug. Originally beyond there was an unusual steel bridge leading to the gents' toilets. Alas, that has now gone, and there is just a sensible normal corridor leading to the gents today. Let's look at the name quickly. It was possibly named for Charles Fitzroy, 1st Baron Southampton, who in 1786 bought an estate encompassing the area on which the pub sits today, and then he, presumably along with his descendants, was responsible for developing the area. Given the likely mid-1800s origin of this pub, it could be more likely that it was named for the 3rd Baron Southampton, conveniently also a Charles Fitzroy. There are suggestions in some of the local papers that there has been a pub on this site going all the way back to 1752. I'm a touch sceptical about that. If we look at Greenwood's map of 1828, admittedly we are right on the edge here, and it may be that the site of the pub was just beyond the extent of the map at that time. We've missed it. But you can generally get a sense that the area around here was all undeveloped fields at that time. I don't think the streets around here were laid out until later, possibly the 1840s onwards. I believe the pub probably came into being in the 1850s, which is also the date of the current building. Here's the earliest newspaper mention I was able to find of a licence transfer in 1854. Here's the pub marked on the Ordnance Survey map of the 1870s on the corner of Southampton Road and what was at that time Fitzroy Road, presumably taken from the family name for the Barons Southampton. Today that's called Grafton Terrace. Karl Marx lived on Grafton Terrace between 1856 and 1864, so roughly coinciding with the first few years of the pub. There are even claims that he was a regular in here, although I don't think there's any proof of that. More recent regulars include actor Bill Nighy, whose name I find quite hard to pronounce, and the members of the 80s pop band Bananarama, apparently. I wanted to include this pub on today's itinerary, even though it's perhaps slightly outside the bounds of what people would generally consider as being Belsize Park. We're getting close to Kentish Town here, but it is a success story of a pub that has actually reopened after a period of closure. I believe it only reopened about 2 or 3 months ago at the end of 2024, possibly November 2024. There was a little bit of back and forth during its period of closure, and there were some disputes from some of the local residents. There have been some new developments, some large new blocks of flats here. Some of the local residents were a bit concerned about the potential for noise and all the usual issues to do with pubs, but I think they eventually came to a compromise and the pub was able to reopen. The pub is now owned by a company called Milegate, who I'm not sure I've encountered before, but apparently own quite a few pubs across London, although they don't tend to actually get that involved in the day-to-day running of the pub. Camera's website lists the operator as independent, and I believe it is a young couple. I met one of them, a lady called Amy, who are now running the pub. Here's a quick shot of what was on the bar, the hand pumps there. I went for a half of London Pride, and I have to say that's in very good shape. That's going to be it for today here from outside the Lord Southampton. Very nice to end on a high note, a success story of a pub that has risen from the ashes. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.